So welcome to Restorative Root Facilitation Skills Training. I'm Amanda Aguilera, and I am currently serving Naropa as a Senior Director of Mission, Culture, and Inclusive Community. And this training is designed to help you become a restorative practice facilitator in all of its forms, so both informally and formally. It serves as the foundation and is a prerequisite for all the restorative practice facilitator trainings. So in this training, we're going to do a little overview of the principles of restorative practice and a little bit of the background where it comes from and the paradigm of restorative practices. So many of us have grown up in cultures where traditional justice systems involve reward and punishment systems. And so restorative practices is a very different approach to harm. And so we're going to explore what that means. And then we're also going to go over some skills that you'll need as a facilitator of restorative practices. So some things that are helpful in navigating as a facilitator. And then also some information about CREST, the Community Repair and Support Team, which is our group of volunteers who volunteer to facilitate restorative practices for the university. So to start off with, I like to use this quote by Kay Pranis, who's written a lot of books on restorative justice. And she says, "I'm continually humbled by human capacities for openness, heart-centered connecting, humility, compassion, understanding, and love. I find that restorative justice helps us connect with our deepest and best selves and bring these dimensions of ourselves to some of the hardest challenges we face." And, again, this is restorative practices is a very different orientation where we have that opportunity to tap into and connect with our best selves and see the best selves in others, even when harm has been caused, which is a very different kind of experience than traditional justice systems or adjudicative justice systems. So there's really an opportunity in restorative practices to do things very differently. So the 5 R's, my mentor in restorative justice, my very first mentor and teacher was Beverly Tidal, who's now transitioned into another realm. But she came up with the 5 R's of restorative practices. And we basically say if these 5 are not present in what we're calling restorative practices, then it's actually not restorative. Right? So you can call it a restorative circle. You can say that you're doing restorative justice or restorative practices, but if these 5 things are not present in what it is that you're doing, then it's actually not restorative. So the first and foremost of these is respect for yourself and others. And that's recognizing the basic dignity of each individual that's involved. The second is relationship. So anytime harm is caused, the primary focus is on the relationship and not necessarily on the laws or rules that were broken. Third is repair. So repair is in contrast to punishment. So when we identify the impacts or harms that were caused, the goal then is to actually seek to repair those specific impacts or harms. So it's not some random punishment, like do some community service, that's not actually related to the harm itself. Responsibility is another pretty primary focus and is the foundation of restorative practices. So the person who caused harm has to be willing to take some level of responsibility. And It may not be total responsibility. They may not be expressing remorse, but if they can at least say, yeah, I did that thing, then they are eligible to participate in restorative practices, right? So if someone is accused of something and says, I didn't do that, then restorative practices can't happen, right? Then another process of investigating, gathering evidence, and then seeing who's right or wrong has to happen. And then finally, reintegration, which I think in modern day restorative justice, this piece is a little bit mystical because we don't really have this practice in general in our culture. We don't really know how to reintegrate folks after harm has been committed, right? Because what we're used to doing is punishing and then excluding or canceling, or in some way saying you don't belong, right? Because you did this thing. And so restorative practices is a pretty radical, different way of saying you caused this harm, which means that you're a human being. And we've now created an opportunity for not only for you to take responsibility, but also to repair the harm that has been done. And once you've repaired that harm, you're welcome back into the community because you took responsibility and repaired the harm. So in a way, it allows folks to move forward without having to carry it all behind them, right? Many of you know that in our current justice system in the United States, people carry a criminal record, which influences all kinds of things for the rest of their life, right? A lot of people with felonies can't get student financial aid. They can't get apartments sometimes. They can't, get housing or whatever. So there's a lot in our justice system where it just follows you forever. And so your identity becomes the behavior that you did in the past. And so this is a really important part of restorative practices is that reintegration. Any questions so far before I move on? Okay. So Howard Zehr is considered the grandfather of restorative justice in Western restorative justice in the United States. And he poses 3 questions that I think are really helpful for understanding the differences between traditional justice and restorative justice. And I think they just help to further illustrate what we're talking about in terms of the paradigm shift. So the retributive justice system, which is what we currently have in our criminal justice system, it's called retributive justice. They look at 3 questions, which is number 1, what law was broken? Or in a school system, it might be what rule was broken. Number 2, who broke that law? Who broke the rule? And number 3, how are we going to punish that person? In restorative justice, we look at, instead of what law was broken, what harm was done? What harm was done? So you can see that, again, the centralization of relationship here. It's also much bigger, right? So when we look at what law was broken, we're not actually looking at all the extensive harms that were done to everyone. So often in the retributive justice system, the victim is completely left out of the process, which can be pretty devastating and also may cause them to be unable to move forward. So we look at the harm not only to the quote unquote victim, the person who is directly harmed, but also what about to the community that victim and offender, or the person who caused harm and the person who was harmed, what harm was done to that community? What harm was done to the person who committed the harm to begin with? by committing that act? What harm was done to the family members, right? So we start to see the ripple effect of the harm. It's not just this law that was broken, but it's actually what harm was done to the individuals involved. And then instead of who did it, we're looking at who's responsible for repair. And again, it's a little bit bigger here, a little bit more expansive, because often once we have identified the person who caused harm, then we just move on with the justice process. But in restorative practices, we look at there might be responsibility shared by multiple people. For example, the person who committed the harm is responsible, right, for the harm, but are there other people or systems that might also cause the conditions for that harm to arise? So we look at that as well. There might be responsibility on the part of the institution. There might be responsibility on the part of the parents. So we look at all of the, the expansive sense of responsibility there. And then what will repair the harm? Instead of how we're going to punish the person, we look at, again, the actual harms that were done, and we seek to repair those harms, not some random thing that the person has to do to prove that they have paid their dues. But it's actually recognizing, oh, I caused this specific harm. So we brainstorm together in a circle. What are ways that those harms can be made right to the extent possible, right? Like some things can't be repaired, but to the extent possible, what can be done so that we can all move forward? There are many different types of restorative practices, ranging from informal to formal processes. And restorative justice is just one type of process in the justice circles there. You'll see there's different colors also. So the connection circles and solution circles, the gold ones in the middle, those are proactive relationship building processes. So we're in connection circles, we bring people together just to bring people together and to build relationship. We might have a theme for the circle, but it's really about getting to know each other and deepening the intimacy of the community, of the group. Solution circles are circles where we see a potential problem or a problem that's beginning to arise. And we say, hey, we see this tension, we see this issue. Let's get together and see if we can come up with ways to attend to that tension or resolve that issue. What are some safe to try solutions that we can try together? So these are proactive processes. And then on the far left, you'll see very informal processes. They might be in the moment. They could be simply one word or one phrase. So in impact statements, we can use things like affective statements or observations, where we say something like, wow, when you say the word, whatever the word is that feels offensive, I feel really sad, right? And it can just be that. It can just be that. There doesn't need to be an entire conversation. It's just letting people know an impact. And then restorative conversations are can be very casual and in the moment, or they can be more formal. So there's a continuum within just restorative conversations, but it's a little bit more involved, where there's some sort of harm that's happened, that you can identify some sort of behavior or act or speech that has caused harm. Restorative conversations are really for when you want to make an investment in relationship, right? Effective statements can also be that, but it's also, effective statements are also great for strangers, right? Like you may not see this person again, but you want them to understand the impact they had. Whereas restorative conversations are a little bit more involved. And in the restorative conversation facilitator training happening tomorrow, you can go through kind of the whole process of that and facilitate those in your own life and also for other people. And then finally, on the far right, you'll see the more formal processes, justice circles. So restorative justice circles take on many different forms. There's community group conferencing, family group conferencing, there's victim offender mediation. There's so many different names, and depending on what sort of system or institution they're happening in, will depend on what process is used. And then reintegration circles are intentional circles after repair has happened, where we bring together the same people that addressed the harm to begin with in a justice circle for intentionally reintegrating someone into a community. So there's some sort of ceremony or ritual that brings them back into right relationship in a conscious, intentional way. So these are kind of the range and types of restorative practices, and these have grown over the years, and they probably will continue to grow. So I want to shift now into kind of the paradigm of restorative practices. And one of the central pieces of understanding restorative practices is really first to understand conflict. So when I talk about conflict, I define it in a little bit different way than most people. And it's in alignment with restorative practices and how I have been learning in restorative principles. And the presence of different needs, beliefs, expectations, and or commitments is how I define conflict. And the reason why this is important for me is that it doesn't indicate that anyone is bad or wrong. That it's really just our diversity creating tension. And when we're allowed to show up in our diversity, then inevitably, right, it's going to rub up against someone else's needs, beliefs, expectations, or commitments. And so when that happens, instead of going into shame and blame, figuring out who's right and who's wrong, we can actually investigate together, oh, what were your needs here? Well, let me share with you what my needs were. And then we can examine, is there a way forward that we can find to meet our needs to the extent possible, both of our needs. So it just transforms how we even enter the conversation to begin with, right? And if any of you have been in a conflict, which I'm assuming if you're human, you have. Otherwise, I'd really like to talk with you after the training. You know that when there's defensiveness, shame, or blame, it's so much harder to have a conversation, right? So when we can approach it in this kind of different way of looking at conflict, we're available for more possibility, for more opportunity. Dominic Barter, who is another great restorative justice teacher, he's in Brazil and a wonderful practitioner. You can look up videos of his if you're interested. He says conflict is not a problem that needs solving, but a phenomenon that needs understanding. And again, the shame, blame game, right, gets in the way of that. So at Naropa, we're really trying to build a conflict positive culture where we say, actually, conflict is a really good sign. It means that our diversity is allowed to show up. The necessary part then becomes, how do we do that skillfully so that that conflict can actually be generative instead of causing more harm? So often, the thing that we have conflict about isn't the thing that causes harm. It's how we go about the conflict that causes harm. So really understanding that if we can acknowledge that conflict is inevitable, it's an inevitable part of being human, we can choose to be engaged and connected when we make mistakes or when conflict is present. And then we can create this open, positive engagement rather than the shame blame game where we tend to react punitively or we avoid altogether. We have a very conflict avoidant culture, and that's mostly because we're afraid of being punished. And that's generally our experience when we cause harm or we're in conflict. We're punished or excluded in some way. So in our brains, if you raise your right hand, this is conflict or making mistakes or harm. And then raise your left hand, this is pain, right? And now put them together. This is how it is in your brain, right? Because over time, the conflict and the harm that we caused or the mistakes we made we've been punished or excluded, right? Which is the most painful experience, especially to be excluded as human beings, is the most painful experience because it's a survival issue, right? So of course we're going to avoid that, because in our brains it's become, this is inevitably going to lead to my own pain or exclusion, right? So if we can transform how we view conflict to begin with and make it a generative experience where you're not excluded or thrown away or canceled or any of those things, but you're actually held accountable. No, not even held accountable. That's passive. It's like you're given space, opportunity, and support to recognize your responsibility and given opportunity, space, and support to repair. And you're held throughout that whole thing, and you're never thrown away, but you're actually then reintegrated and celebrated. Wow, what a different, right, way of being together. So I want to pause here, and I'm going to stop share and just see if there are any questions or comments or thoughts before we move into the skills part of facilitating restorative processes themselves.
Yeah, I have a question. This is great so far. And I just wonder if you ever feel like there's a conflict or something that is too big to approach or that we can't quite tackle just with beginner facilitator skills or whatever. Do you feel like there are certain things that are like, yeah, I don't know, just beyond a little bit?
Yeah. So in several different ways, right? So there are certain types of harm that are really tricky for bringing people together. So restorative practices brings offenders and victims, and I'm using that for ease of speech, not to label them permanently. We bring them together in the same room, in the same circle, right? So, and typically we separate them and keep them separated, which is also problematic. But there are certain harms where if we bring them together too soon, it can be harmful. There's certain, relationships or harm that make bringing people together very complicated. So people who are manipulative, or there's been ongoing sexual abuse, that can be, and there's a significant power differential that can be very tricky. So certainly the greater the harm, the more time there needs to be for healing and preparation before we bring people together. So they've used restorative justice for murder cases, but it can take years of pre-conferencing, which we'll talk about what pre-conferencing is, but it takes years of preparation on both sides and even for the families. And so it takes a lot of time investment, and most institutions do not feel that it's worth that much time, right? Yeah. But if you are to look long-term at the additional harm that's caused by, it's similar to like, I have a 5-year-old, right? I could get a message across very quickly by spanking her, right? It's a quick, easy, well, not easy for me, but easy for some people to just, like, don't do that, right? It's a quick thing. Yeah. But at what cost? Right? What I'm sacrificing to communicate very quickly with a punitive action that's also causes harm, I'm sacrificing our relationship, our trust, right? So over time, she's not going to trust me, and she's going to be afraid to tell me things, and I'm her primary support person. So she's going to deal with things on her own, and what do you think is going to happen? She's going to become resentful of me. She won't have her primary support person to help her through, to navigate things, right? So this is, and if we look at that on the justice scale, we are sacrificing relationship for expediency, but actually it's not expedient because we're creating more harm, right? More issues, mistrust of the system, lack of support. The justice system perpetually for decades, since I've been collecting the data, has been around 70%, the recidivism rate, which is the reoffense rate. So when someone commits a harm, they're 70% likely to commit another harm. That has been ongoing for decades because the structure itself is set up to perpetuate. So when we say, well, that costs too much or that takes too much time, does it? Yep. If we look at the big picture. So to get back to your question, sorry, I got off on a tangent there, but there are definitely situations, and at Naropa, we've identified there's certain things that we won't have a restorative process around. We call ourselves restorative first, and those things are identified in the handbook, but they're pretty like egregious things. The other thing is if the person's not willing to take responsibility, like I said before, or if the person has severe mental illness, or is in psychotic state, or is unable to understand what responsibility is, or so those things make it challenging. Okay. Does that get at what you were?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah. It helped me feel, I just feel a tension in myself, like, oh, I love this. I want to do it. And I don't want to cause more harm.
Yeah.
And just we trying to navigate that. Yeah.
And we won't throw you in the deep end, right? Like you start out with the small things, and there's always 2 facilitators when you have a circle. So when there's like significant harm, there's always 2 facilitators. And you start out, as a co-facilitator and kind of apprentice in that way.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That was great.
I want to follow Dao. I have a question also, and I want to preface it by saying I don't want to cause harm. The last time I asked a question, I did a microaggression, just asking a question. So Whew, talk about showing up. It's hard, but I want to do this so much. Does harm equal impact that doesn't feel good?
That's a really good question.
I mean,
Because
how do we move
impacts
through
can
the
also,
world? Sorry, I mean, I'm just curious, like how to move through the world without our very existence hurting others.
well, that's kind of the point, right? Is that we're always causing harm,
Mm.
right? That we're always impacting, and we don't know if that's a positive or negative or neutral impact until we have conversation about it, right? And if we create an environment where people feel empowered and held and supported to name, hey, that didn't feel good, and for you to know that you're not going to get punished or canceled because you caused a negative impact, right? Then that's what creates the ability for us to navigate instead of pretending that it doesn't exist or that we're supposed to never cause harm, or that we're supposed to be perfect and good so that I won't cause harm. And then that ideal of perfect or good, which actually doesn't exist, creates so much shame and separation and hiding and deception and burying things. And so yeah, you're going to, when I teach about social power dynamics, I always say you're going to misuse your power. It's not if, it's when. So I think if we can create environments where mistakes are celebrated in a way, like, yay, this is an opportunity for you to learn about something. Like when you asked that question that there was like that caused harm that you were unaware of, right? And you were made aware of it, but you were held, right? And it was able to be explored. And right. So that's an opportunity for learning. It's just so valuable, because otherwise, how do we grow? How do we,
Thanks for speaking to it. I want to just offer a quick reply to what you just said. I should have led with it first by saying everything you just spoke about for the last whatever since we started has been so potent and beautiful. And in some ways, I feel like my inner child is being reparented by listening to you. If I could have received that as a child, that kind of understanding about what you wrote, diversity, intention, conflict positive, that you're not a bad person. I mean, it's healing for me as an adult in this program to hear it. And I can imagine how many people without the self-awareness that we practice at Naropa really want to feel allowed into our fullness, to make mistakes and not be bad for it. It was really nice listening to everything you've said so far. I feel resonance. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Everyone says that you must be such a wonderful parent. And I'm like, I'm not really, because I grew up with the same trauma and right? Like the same. So when I get dysregulated or sick or tired, I'm a single mom, so I have to hold it all. And so I don't respond to my daughter well each time. I don't always have time to be like, okay, this is why you can't do this. And sometimes I'm like, stop, but the important piece is like, how do you repair that? So do I go back and say, wow, I got busy and I shouldn't have yelled, and what can we do to make this right? That's the important piece, is can we say, I'm sorry, and how can I do this a little bit differently next time? Are we ready to dive into some facilitator skills? Awesome. This part is to prepare you for facilitating restorative practices. And a lot of this is really about more formal conversations or more formal restorative justice circles. But some of it can also be used or applied when you're just facilitating conflict in your own life. So the definition of facilitate is to make an action or process easy or easier. And the reason why I start off right off the bat with this is because often, especially at Naropa, there's a lot of therapists or people training to be therapists. And so you're used to sitting in this role where your job is to, well, actually your job is to facilitate, but it's hard to do that. And I think often when we get in leadership positions, we tend to get in a teaching role or a guiding role, or in some way efforting to move the process yourself. And the idea is to actually take a step back, to be behind the scenes, right? And to allow the people in the process to do their work. And you're there to make sure that that work for them is as easy as it can be. Their work as easy as it can be. So often we take it on as our own work, and it's their work, right? So in light of you are there to make things easier, there's some preparation that typically needs to happen before a restorative conversation or a circle. And these are some things that can help you to prepare and make it easier for the folks in the process. So number one is to know the participants that are involved in the process. And you don't have to like know them, but hopefully you have already pre-conferenced with them to some degree. You've gotten some sort of write-up or information from the restorative community office where you can anticipate what are some of the special needs of the folks in the process. Are there any particular accommodations that need to be made? Do you need to make sure you have a place with a wheelchair ramp or a bathroom, or that's warmer or colder, or etc.? So just knowing that what the needs are, and also knowing if there's any particular things about any of the people that you should be aware of that you can help navigate. So if for example, if there's one person who tends to dominate the conversation, it can be helpful to know that ahead of time so that you can help to make sure there's equal talking time. That's just an example. Use the script. So there's a script for every process, and you will receive that script when you go to that particular training. So for example, there's a restorative conversation script, there's a solution circle script, there's a connection circle script. So especially when you're starting out, you can literally read from the script. Because that script has been crafted over decades, I gained the script from my mentor who had been using it for many, many years. This is a process that works if you follow the script and you trust the process. So I think often, and maybe this is later on, so maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but just use a script and it will be easier. And you don't have to feel like you need to go off script too early, right? Once the process is in you and you've done it enough times, then you can kind of, go off script. But in the beginning, relying on that so you're not missing any steps is important. A key to facilitation, right, is asking the right questions at the right time. So questions are your friend because they allow the people to do the work, right? So you should mostly either be silent or asking questions, apart from reading the guidelines or anything like that. So if you find yourself talking a lot and it's not a question, then it's probably a sign you should take a step back and allow the people to do the work. So designing questions, there are questions in the script for each particular process, and you may want to customize the questions. So if you talk to the case manager, which could be either Jamila, myself, or Key, who is a work study, you might want to craft customized questions for this particular circle, or adjust the questions. And you should always have more questions than you need. Often the participants will answer a question before you even ask it. And so obviously you won't need to ask it then, but having more than you need is helpful. Ask for support. So either from your co-facilitator or from the case manager, the staff and other volunteers are here to help. So if you're feeling unsure, if let's say you do a pre-conference with folks and a lot of things come up and it's not exactly what it seemed, sometimes you'll get a case and it looks like, oh, this will be easy. And then you get in the first pre-conference and all these other issues come up and it suddenly gets very complex. So you can always feel free to say, hey, this has suddenly got complex. Can you help me navigate this? And we're always happy to do that. Make sure that you arrive early. You can set up the space and be there to welcome participants as they arrive. So again, in restorative practices, we're looking at all the elements, right? We're making sure that we've made contact with each of the participants, because them trusting you to some degree has a huge bearing on the process going more smoothly. So if you can make contact with folks and be warm and inviting and non-judgmental, those things help everyone to relax. Because again, we're there usually because there's some sort of conflict or harm. So allowing people to really their nervous systems to kind of relax. So that means you could have music, or there could be laughter, or so allowing things to be warm to the degree possible. The other part of setting up the space is, especially if you're doing like a formal restorative justice circle where there's lots of people, so there could be like 5, 6, 12 people. We write name tags for each person, and then we put those name tags in the chairs. So we design who's going to sit where. And that's a part of setting up the space, right? Yeah, so making sure the temperature is right, that, you have all your things. We traditionally break bread together after a restorative process, and usually nowadays that looks like we eat snacks while we fill out feedback forms. But it's just helpful to eat after you go through something intense like a conflict or something. So we always have like snacks and tea on hand, and we restock those and have those available in the Restorative Community Cottage, which is Upaya North. And that's where the Restorative Community Office is. We also have packets, which are those plastic accordion folders. And those packets have scripts, feedback forms, resource sheets, Kleenex, name tags, all of those things that you would need in a process. So when you pick up a packet, you'll pick up one of those things, and also the snack basket. But we'll go over that more when you do kind of more formal restorative justice training. And then a talking piece might be used, especially if it's a connection circle. And that's just a way to honor the person who's speaking, and also indicate when your turn's over and then it's another person. It also keeps crosstalk from happening. So often, one of the beauties of connection circles, which if you're going to the training today, you'll discover, is that each person can speak without there needing to be other things said about that. It can just stand on its own and be that. And it promotes just listening and absorbing that. So a talking piece can support it. We also have a whole bunch of talking pieces available in the restorative community office. So you can just pick one. We have a little kind of, it's not an altar, but it kind of feels like that. We just have like all these pieces. So whatever feels connected to what you're doing. Responsibilities of the facilitator. So these are the primary things that you need to make sure that you're doing in addition to taking a step back and allowing the people to do the work, is holding the space, which means you're holding that container. So you'll be sharing guidelines of the process and making sure that you are following those guidelines, that you're modeling respect and recognizing the dignity of each person, and maintaining the ground rules. So that means you'll have to learn how to interrupt people in order to do your job of maintaining the ground rules, which I think can be challenging for some people to learn how to interrupt a process. But that's one of the pieces that you're responsible for, is holding that container. And we can talk about ways to actually maintain a ground rules or interrupt in a way that feels respectful of yourself, of others in the process. What else did I want to say about the space? It's left me, so hopefully it'll come back. I've said this a lot, trust the process, and you won't be able to do that until you've experienced it. There is a group wisdom that's greater than any one individual. And this is part of that kind of stepping back and allowing them to do the work piece that I've been talking about. It can feel like you need to step in and do the work for them, but I want to challenge you to instead trust that the group will get there. And that, again, takes practice, because it's not how we do things with leadership typically. Empower participants. So asking them questions, encouraging them, validating them. So you can say things like, that sounds really hard, or wow, I just want to recognize the bravery it takes to just show up here, or to say what you just said, or right. So we're also there to be kind of their cheerleaders, right? And then ensuring equal voice. And part of this, so making sure that, you know, not any one person is dominating, that if anyone is quiet, they're speaking up. And the structure of the process itself really creates this. So there's very little that you'll need to do if you follow the process, because it creates that opportunity. But one of the responsibilities, and this is why it's helpful to have a facilitator and co-facilitator, especially when there's more than just one or two people, is that while one person is asking the questions or following the scripts, the other person can be tracking for kind of nonverbal cues, reactions, things like that. So you'll know, oh, I probably need to check in with this person because it sounds like they're in a shame spiral, or it looks like they're shutting down or dissociating or getting upset, or so that can be helpful.
I just want to name this, but I notice myself continuing to go back to, like, what's a model of this working in the world? Where is a model of this working in the world? And I know that you've already said, like, this isn't something that, you know, bigger organizations are using, but just naming, like, my bias of, like, really wanting to find, you know, a model of seeing this working. So I'm excited to experience it. And and just continue learning about it. So thank you. I just wanted to name that bias that I'm.
Yeah, totally. Jamila.
Hey, Daisy. I've seen it work in high schools and elementary schools. Like the whole system will be restorative first, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's where I come from, is from schools, from elementary and high school and middle school. And it takes a lot of convincing. No, actually, for teachers who have this like natural instinct to do this stuff, it doesn't take a lot of convincing. They're already doing it. And then for folks who are like very pro discipline as fast as you can and as like hard as you can, they just need a few weeks of seeing kids react to this in a positive way. And I'll talk more about that in the connection circle training after this one.
And kids, this makes so much sense to them. Like there are whole middle schools where the kids, when they have an issue, they go to the restorative room. They have already been taught how to do this, and one kid will facilitate other two kids' conflict. Yeah, and there's no adult that even gets involved. They just know what to do.
I've seen kids on the playground like stop and sit in a circle and talk it out. So like it, yeah, if you train them from when they're young, this is like instinct to them. So.
Which, yeah, I mean, so for kids, it's like, oh, this is what we do. Right. For adults, it also works. It just, there's been so much trust that's been broken. And so it's a little bit harder for people to come to the table or even agree to do it. But there's like the entire New Zealand youth justice system is restorative justice. They don't have retributive justice at all. And one of the tribes that, so the Maori of New Zealand, this is how their tribal justice works. This is where restorative justice was inspired from. So in indigenous cultures, where relationship is central, not only to survival, but to their spiritual way of being, they don't have prisons to put people, right? You have to be in relationship. And so you have to deal with these things. You can't just you don't throw people away. So this is a natural system that arose from that. And it's used, so Colorado is kind of a leader in restorative justice. We passed legislation in, I think, 2009, or maybe it's 2012, I can't remember, but we passed legislation in restorative justice, and we have all over Colorado, there's restorative justice inside of traditional justice systems, everywhere from police to DAs to courts, to at every level of the system. And the sooner, I was fortunate enough to be trained with police, and if we can catch it with the police, then they stay out of the system altogether, right? So then they don't have that record following them. But yeah, it's just convincing people who are in a very different paradigm that this works, and you don't know until you actually experience it. Fortunately and unfortunately, Naropa doesn't have a lot of rule breakers. I mean, we're rule breakers, but not like in a like harm causing way often. So there's not a whole lot to, but there's the Boulder DA's office you can volunteer with. There's the Longmont Community Justice Partnership. There's stuff all over Denver. So if you're interested in volunteering and seeing how this works. So Howard Zare is a white cis man, but he's very connected. Actually, a lot of his work came working with gangs and gang crime specifically. And what he found was they just wanted respect. And the only place they got that was a gang. So when they started to feel respected in a justice process, it transformed, right, their ability to engage in responsibility and repair and recognize harm and all those things. So anyway, yeah, Howard Zer's written books. I encourage you, if you're interested, to read. There's the Little Book of Restorative Justice, which is a great place to start. It's a short book and it has a lot of this stuff in it. Yeah, there's many. Well, I think we have a resource page somewhere on our My Naropa page. Any other questions or? Okay, so moving now into recognizing how to navigate the emotional experience in the process is also really critical, because one of the things that can derail the process is emotional dysregulation or shame, or so learning how to recognize that and to navigate that is a pretty critical skill. And obviously in 20 minutes, you're not going to learn how to do that here. But it feels important for me to name, and something that I encourage you to look into further for doing this work. So tracking the emotional experience in the process, again, this is why it's helpful to have more than one facilitator if there's more than a couple of people, because there's a lot going on emotionally for everyone when there's harm that's been caused. So in restorative practices, oh, this is a quote that I love. I've learned that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So this is just another reminder in the role of facilitator. Again, your job is that helping to feel people, help people, sorry, can't speak today, helping people to feel welcomed and as psychologically safe as possible is an important piece here. So some of you, if you've taken other trainings with me, I use this image a lot because it's important to understand what's happening in the brain when we become dysregulated. So you'll see that there's green part, blue part, and red part. This is a very vast oversimplification of the brain. But essentially, we have this red part, which is the brain stem, which basically monitors our survival. And so it's responsible for enacting our fight, flight, freeze that maintains our survival. This is where if this gets enacted, then we become emotionally dysregulated. And then the blue part is our limbic system. It does a lot of things. There's a lot going on in the limbic system, but essentially our emotions and the link between our emotions and our memories happen here. So you remember when I had you hold up the two hands and bring them together? This is where conflict and pain, right, have become fused or associated. And the beautiful thing about the brain is we have neuroplasticity, which means we can change that, we can unhook that, right, with new experiences and create different associations. But the limbic system is also responsible for letting the brainstem know. So it's scanning the environment for threats, and it lets the brainstem know, hey, we got a threat here or a potential threat here. And then the prefrontal lobes are involved in executive functioning, which is complex thought, impulse control, planning, those sorts of things. So There's someone named Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a child psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. He's written several really great books. I encourage you to check those out if you're interested. But he came up with a really good system that I think is really helpful for us to understand. Often when we're in conflict, we tend to go directly to reasoning, especially if we have that capacity. If we are in an up power position, we have typically more capacity for reasoning. We tend to be in our prefrontal lobes. But if we are the one who's been harmed or victimized or microaggressed or oppressed or any of those things, we tend to be in fight, flight, or freeze. And sometimes both people, the person who causes harm and the person who's being harmed, are both in a survival state, which makes things really just escalate, right? So recognizing when we are dysregulated is really important for us to be able to even engage in the process. So there's a lot of ways you can look for someone who is dysregulated. Does anyone know what dysregulation looks like on themselves or others? Are there any outward tells that you can share with us that you see? What does dysregulation look like? You can put it in the chat or.
I could speak for myself and say that for me, sometimes like I'll disconnect, I'll like start looking away or looking down and just kind of put sort of an energetic wall between me and the other person.
Form of disconnection or dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
I can either start talking really quickly or shut down and not talk at all, or the other.
I think my tendency is to lean back and sort of disengage. And I, just like in my family system, I guess, speaking from experience there, like there's also sometimes an energy that comes out like forward and like aggression. But I think it's still like dysregulation. It's just a different form of that.
Yeah, so that dysregulation can arise at any point in the process, right? People can show up dysregulated. They can get dysregulated when someone says a particular thing that activates them. And depending on the person, they may be able to regulate themselves fairly quickly, or they might just be gone, right? And so part of your job is to make sure that people are regulated enough to stay in the conversation. And it might be that someone is so dysregulated that you might as well not be having the conversation, because when people are dysregulated, you literally cannot learn. You can't take in information. Sometimes people can't form words. So at that point, it's helpful to pause the process or sometimes reschedule the process. Because otherwise, so pushing forward is actually not going to be helpful. So Bruce Perry talks about there's a certain series that has to happen in order for us to be engaged in a conversation around conflict or harm, or just any conversation. So one is to regulate. So first we have to get emotionally regulated, and that can look very different for different people. Some people need to be connected. They need a hug. They need a purring cat on their lap. They need, right? And other people they need isolation. They need to be left alone. They need space. Sometimes going to the bathroom and washing my hands. For me, water is really helpful for regulating. Taking a bath for me is really regulating. But making sure that you are exploring what will help you to stay regulated. And you can even do that in the one-on-one pre-conferencing with folks. So you can say, hey, sometimes we get dysregulated in these conversations. What helps you to stay regulated? Or is there anything that I can do to support your regulation? Is there a word I can use? Do you need to take a break? Do you need to wash your hands? Do you need to take a walk around the building? So figuring that out to the extent that we can, right? I think this is part of us learning how to be more trauma informed in our restorative justice. Like this definitely wasn't taught to me, but I think pushing forward when we're not regulated is actually harmful. Once we're regulated, then we relate. So we actually have to connect with the other person that we're talking with. So one of the ways that's helpful for us to do this in restorative practices, and this looks a lot of different ways, sometimes we name the strengths of the person who caused harm. Sometimes we talk about the relationship and what's important to them about the relationship. I often will say, this is an investment in relationship. You could use this time and energy in all kinds of other ways, and you're choosing to do this with this person. Why are you doing that? And so I'll have them kind of think about what's important to them about the relationship, even if it's like, well, I have to work with this person. So, and I'd rather not be, tense 24 hours or 8 hours a day when I'm working with them. So just being able to recognize your connection with the other person. And then once you're regulated, you're connected, then you can actually engage in the kinds of things that make conflict generative. So if that makes sense. So regulate, relate, and then reason. Sometimes it's tempting to jump from regulate to reason, or from relate to reason and forget to regulate, or just straight to reason. So just recognizing that there's 3 different parts there. The other thing I want to talk about is shame, which often comes up in restorative practices. It's just so present in our culture. It's a huge barrier to people using their power well, to repair happening, to people taking responsibility. It's a huge, I actually wrote my dissertation on the dynamics of shame and power in the justice system. I'm happy to share that link if anyone's nerdy and interested. But it's a really critical piece to navigating harm, for understanding what happens. So I think Brene Brown, this might be Brene Brown's quote. If so, I need to put her name on it. But it's the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging, unworthy of connection, unworthy of love. So there's a couple different, I think I have the other slide in. Yeah. So in restorative practices, what we're doing is we're helping people to understand that what was done, the behavior or words that happened that caused harm, doesn't mean that they are bad as a person, right? That is shame. I am bad. It's universal. I did this bad thing, therefore I am bad. And kids just naturally go to that, right? They have a very hard time separating what I did from who I am. So that's something that we have to assist people in. So whenever you hear participants say, I'm such a loser, I'm so crazy, or I am this, you can reframe and say, what are the behaviors or the words that caused harm. And the reason this is so important is it's much easier to change a behavior than it is to change an identity, right? To change an identity is huge. And so people tend to give up and just say, well, I guess I'm going to be bad. I guess I am bad. And they take on that identity. They surrender to that identity. So this is another reason why restorative practices is so fundamental for this transformation, because we are maintaining the respect and dignity for that person, even though they caused harm, because what we're dealing with is the behavior and not the person. We're dealing with the bad behavior, not the bad person, if that makes sense. So we started to identify some of these things, but just a note to say, because of mirror neurons, which are amazing little things that help us to empathize, it can also help us to dysregulate. So when we see someone else who's dysregulated, it's a lot easier for us to get dysregulated. That's why when a child is upset and you get upset and start even not even yelling, but you get upset, it just escalates, right? Because of those mirror neurons. So we say when there's an upset kid, you have to be really calm, because that will help them to self-regulate, use a calm voice. So self-regulation looks really different for everyone, but it's important as a facilitator that you're also able to stay regulated, because if you can't stay regulated, then you're responsible for holding the container. It can really get off the rails. And just one note to say that if you get a case that's triggering for you, or the person is triggering for you in some way, and you find that it's hard to stay regulated, don't take the case, right? Like you can transfer that to someone else, because you don't need to work that hard, right? There's someone else that's not going to get as triggered. So you don't need to fight that, right? You can work on that on your own in therapy or whatever, but you don't need to put yourself in that position. So there's a lot of different ways you can stay regulated in the moment. The breath for some people can be really regulating. It can be like a reset button for your nervous system. But for people who have trauma around breath, who have asthma or early childhood breath stuff, it could be activating. So just exploring what helps you. For me, touch is really helpful. So having something that I can touch and focus on, tactile sensation, can really help me. So just finding out what's most useful for you in terms of self-regulation is really important. And just a reminder about trauma-informed care. There's several trainings around trauma-informed care. Perhaps we can bring some to the Restorative Community Institute so that you can take those. But these are the different pieces of trauma-informed care. And I think one of the more important is choice. So making sure that you're giving folks choice always when you're interacting with them, especially if they're still in a trauma response. We likely won't put someone in a circle who's still in acute trauma space. We'll likely wait until they, have healed to the point where they can be regulated for the most part. But making sure that, again, you're recognizing their dignity, even when they're in that trauma space, and giving them choice about when they speak, if they participate, all of that stuff. One of the things about restorative practices to know is that it's always voluntary for every single person in the circle. It does not work as a court-mandated process. It does not work if they feel coerced or manipulated into participating. So that choice piece is really important. I'm choosing to be present for this process. So Another thing to keep in mind as facilitators is, as my mentor, Cedar Barstow, says, self-care is an ethical issue. And so we tend not to be available for our skill set, our ability to regulate, our ability to hold space for others if we haven't tended to our own selves. So this can look, again, many different ways depending on what's useful for you, but making sure that you're taking care of yourself outside of and also inside the circle, right? So that feels really important to name. So really quickly, case logistics. These, I may have to ask Jamila that these percentages might look different now, but it tends to come from about 4 different sources. We get referrals from faculty members, Title IX, student conduct or the care team, and we also get student requests. And we'll have to look and see if these percentages are accurate. This is how it was whenever I first made this training.
They've definitely changed to more student referrals, a lot more students requesting support.
Right. So that's probably a good sign. But we can get cases from any of these sources. This is the typical process that we go through from referral to the actual process. And this is an example of a restorative conversation process, which is what we use mostly at Naropa. We have very few formal larger circles, although I hope to see more. So we receive a referral, and then the case manager, Jamila Key, will review the case. The case manager decides if it's restorative practices appropriate, and mostly, are they taking responsibility? Is everyone willing to participate? Is this an issue that is appropriate? Those sorts of things. And then the case manager will then contact the volunteers through the community repair and support team and say, hey, we have this case. Here's general details. We're looking for someone who is, you know, X, Y, or Z. It could be, we want to have a particular gender identity or expression, or we want someone with a particular social location, or we want someone with particular experience with something, or we may indicate those, or it might just be anyone who's available. And then we'll receive back from you if you're interested in taking the case. The case manager will assign a facilitator to the case, or facilitators if needed. Then you will receive a packet with the case details and all the information. You'll review that packet, and you can ask any questions you have to Jamila or Key. Then you'll set up pre-conferences, which you'll learn about those in your particular facilitator trainings that you choose to take. Pre-conferencing happens individually with each participant, and then the facilitator will determine, based on the schedules of the people involved, when the circle or the conversation should happen. Then the conversation happens. And after the conversation, we ask that you hand out feedback forms. There's actual physical forms. We also have it in electronic form if you're doing it via Zoom. And then you'll submit a debrief form, which is just a short half sheet that gives the case manager a sense of how it went, and if you need any follow-up debrief with them. The any written agreements, if those are made, will go back to the restorative community office, and the case manager will be monitoring those to ensure that they are completed. Okay, so I'm going to stop share here. We're right at time. So enjoy, and thanks for coming. See you all next time.